Today was Disability Awareness Day at the State House.
Organizations from around the state gathered to spread awareness with each other and state lawmakers. Keenan Mills has more.
Tuesday's event, put on by Disability Rights Maine, brought nearly 20 organizations related to disability rights issues together. Not one of them was alike.
All different kinds of organizations that serve different populations, but we all have a collective mission to advance disability rights, and which is really, really important in Maine.
We can help people understand whatever situation they're in, really understand what part of the law applies, and then help them advocate for themselves to get their rights or remove a barrier, or have an entity understand what their obligations are to provide that access to their customers, clientele, or participants.
The event also gave the varying organizations the chance to learn from one another.
I am now able to refer somebody to somebody here in Maine site or Disability Rights Maine, knowing that this is the services they offer. This is where they're going to be able to go and find better answers, more answers, or even protections against discrimination.
It's really important to break down silos between different organizations, and this is a great opportunity to do that. And one of the few opportunities we get every year to come together and collaborate and meet new faces.
What's unique about the event compared to others hosted by DRM is the chance to speak with state legislators. Some of the group was even honored in Tuesday's session in both the Senate and the House.
Today is really about educating legislators and our representatives here in Maine about our issues, and so it's really important to have that time and face-to-face conversation.
Speaking with some of the tablers, they all had one thing in common: wanting to make a difference.
I've had over 5,000 people in my records that I've spoken to or managed in some way, and the thing I like about that is that I like to think that I've changed the world for somebody or in some way that has improved access in some form.
Keenan Mills, WABI News, Augusta.